All right, everyone. So we're going to get on with the Napoleon notes today. So you should be on page 18 of your packets. And I know last time I told you it was page 17 and 18, and I screwed things up. So I'm just telling you right now, it is only page 18 you have to worry about. So we'll just tackle Napoleon and why he matters in this whole French Revolution that we've been talking about. The key question for you about Napoleon is at the bottom. I'll revisit that quote at the top in a second. But the question is, how did Napoleon rise to power? How does he form his great empire? And how does he, along the way, contribute to the development of modern France? Napoleon, when he first takes charge, which we'll get to the how and the why of that momentarily, has a quote where he says, "The French Revolution is over. I am the revolution." And I want you guys to think to yourselves, how much is that true? How much are you buying Napoleon's argument that he is the revolution? And as you can tell based on that quote and that picture, not the most humble of guys that exists in the world, but nonetheless, you will see in some ways he is kind of right. He is the revolution, and I think in other ways he's not so much. That's all I want to say for now about that. And I think our notes as we go through this today will let some insight into what I mean by that exactly. So in Napoleon's early life, he is born in 1769. So it's about 20 years prior to the French Revolution beginning. And he's born on this island of Corsica. Now I'm going to take my mouse and you guys can see France being here, Mediterranean, Italy over here, and then Corsica, this island here, is where Napoleon is born. For most of its history, Corsica was Italian, but then it becomes French territory, and Napoleon's parents are from the upper classes of Corsican society. But that doesn't really mean too much because Corsica isn't natively French. They're not really looked upon well in France. I mean, he might have all the power he wants in Corsica and all the influence he wants in Corsica, but if Napoleon's going to head to Paris and say, I'm one of the elite of Corsica, that's not going to count for all that much. However, the good news for him is because of the revolution, he doesn't have to worry about who his parents were or where he comes from. What Napoleon needs to worry about is how good is he at commanding an army. And fortunately for Napoleon, he's pretty good at it. So by the time he's 28, if you haven't done the math yet, it's 1797. So by the time he's 28, just to be clear for you, the Reign of Terror has been over for 3 years. It ended in 1794. In 1792, he was a captain in the army. He was liked by the Committee of Public Safety, but then once the Reign of Terror ended, he ran into a little bit of problems in terms of being supported. But by 1797, he's a general of an army at age 28, which that's a huge deal. I'm 31, and I teach 9th graders in high school. He's commanding armies when he's 3 years younger than me, so maybe that puts it in perspective for you guys a little bit. He's commanding the French army in Italy, and Italy, if you guys are wondering, why are we fighting Italy exactly? What's going on there? Italy, or at least some states in Italy, Italy's not a unified country yet. Italy is allied in some small part with Austria, and remember, the French have been fighting the Austrian, kind of holding them off from destroying and ending the revolution. And he was successful in Italy, and really did a good job and returned to France pretty well liked and growing in support for sure. Now he's going to go off to Egypt in 1799 because the British had wanted to invade England. That probably doesn't make sense to you. You want to invade England, so you invade Egypt. Now, why they want to invade Egypt to get to England is because in Egypt, there is a canal called the Suez Canal, and we'll discuss it pretty soon here, that really helps the British facilitate trade throughout their empire, specifically India. So the French logic there is, if we can cripple the British in Egypt, then we can just cripple the British kind of worldwide. he pretty much fails in Egypt. He has like 2 successes, and his troops are sick. They're really hungry. Things are pretty ugly and bad there, but he has some successes in Egypt, and for whatever reason, those successes that he has, however small they are, they're the ones that kind of define his legacy there. He's basically going to abandon his troops in Egypt. I don't know a better way to say that. And he's going to head back to France because the government in France at that time, known as the Directory, which comes after the Committee of Public Safety, they're not really successful and they're struggling along. And so he's going to return to France at that point in time. So in 1799, as this Directory government is failing in France, Napoleon decides that he and one of the directors are going to lead what is called a coup d'etat of the government. To say what is that, I do want you to write down what a coup d'etat is. A coup d'etat is a military overthrow of the government. So Napoleon is going to be at the head of this coup d'etat. And so the Directory is going to go away, and he is going to make France what is called a consulate. C-O-N-S-U-L-A-T-E, a consulate. And so consulate, technically, there's going to be 3 people who are going to be ruling the country, but Napoleon's really at the head of it. And technically, France is still a republic, but in reality, Napoleon's kind of just doing what he wants to do. So Napoleon really feels the need that he has to fix what's going on in France, what's wrong in France. And he can't really do that at first because he's got all these wars going on with all these different enemies all throughout Europe. So he's going to put an end to most of these wars. And by 1801, he defeats Austria. Italy pretty much backs off of fighting him because the Catholic Church gets accepted in France again, and so they really don't have too many problems after that point. He's going to make peace with England in 1802. All this to say, it's because he wants to fix home first. So, war's on pause. We're going back to war. Don't you worry. So what he does in the meanwhile is he reforms France. He's going to fix what's going on in France. He's going to give the central government more power to do what it needs to do. France needs money. They're fighting a lot of wars. They need finances. They need revenue to continue to maintain the country. So he's going to give more power to the central government, allow them to improve themselves in terms of collecting taxes so they can address this debt that they're in. He's going to institute what is called the Napoleonic Code, which is known for a lot of different major developments. It's going to preserve a uniform law code in France. It's going to get rid of serfdom or feudalism. It is going to allow for a freedom of religion in France. So he doesn't destroy the Catholic Church. He realizes that's one of France's oldest institutions, and to try to destroy it would be like destroying the hearts of millions of people in France. So that can't happen. He is going to work to institute public education. He is going to ensure that this law code makes all citizens equal in terms of the law, allows individuals to choose a profession as they see fit. So a lot of these different things are going to be instituted by Napoleon. And so as I'm saying all these things, I'm sure in your mind, hopefully, if you look at the question at the bottom, it says, in what ways do these reforms reflect the values the French Revolution emphasized? If you think back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, you should be hearing a lot of things that they were talking about, that they wanted to institute. The weird thing is Napoleon is almost like a dictator ensuring all of these things are happening. So it's kind of a complicated thing. Again, back to my question, to what extent is Napoleon really representing the revolution? In many ways he is, but in some ways not so much. So after this point, Napoleon is able to readdress his goal, which is to create a grand empire throughout all of Europe. He's going to get to work pretty quickly on trying to accomplish these goals as well. In 1806, he conquers what is called, and I'll swirl around it with my mouse, what's called the Confederation of the Rhine right here. Now, if you're saying to yourself, I'm pretty sure that's just Germany, you're right in 2018. But in 1806, there's no such thing as a unified Germany. And for that matter, if you look down at the old boot of Europe down here, what we know as Italy is not Italy either in terms of being a unified country. So we'll get to that later on. So anyway, he conquers the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. In 1807, gets Spain, gets Portugal. And the important thing that you need to understand is while all this is happening, he is destroying the old aristocratic societies, the old social class systems that has tied together these nations for all these decades and centuries for that matter. So along the way, he is going to spread the idea that all citizens are equal before the law. He's going to spread religious tolerance throughout Europe. Remember, Protestant Reformation created a lot of religious intolerance between Catholics and Protestants, and he's going to do away with that, as well as instituting the ability that people have the freedom to choose a career as they pursue, as they see fit. And the nobility and the clergy are really going to lose their power at this time. So Napoleon is going to spread what are known back then as liberal principles, which we will revisit shortly. Napoleon is even going to be crowned emperor, and you can tell by in the bottom right corner. I was pretty impressed with that. That's a picture of me at the Louvre where this painting is on display. But the reason why this is a big deal, the reason why I'm surprised to my little snap face there, is because it's said that when Napoleon was going to be crowned by the emperor, and you can see in the picture right here, Napoleon takes the crown from the emperor, from the Pope, and he puts it onto his own head. And the significance of this gesture is the idea that if the Pope puts the crown on your head, the Catholic Church gives you permission to be emperor. If you place the crown on your own head, then there is no one who gives you the authority other than yourself. In other words, there is no authority that stands above Napoleon as emperor. And so that's the big focus there. So, Napoleon does not succeed in maintaining an empire. Obviously, France does not control all of Europe. And there's a few reasons why this happens. I want to go to number 2 first in terms of talking through it. Napoleon always has his eyes set on getting hold of England because England, with its sea power, is able to cripple France, by controlling how much trade can flow in and out of France over the seas. So Napoleon wants to put an end to that British power by taking over England. He can't do it through a sea battle because, again, his navy just can't stand up to them. So he tries to do it by implementing this thing called the continental system. And what the continental system is going to be basically a plan where Napoleon says to all of these countries throughout Europe that he controls, he tells them they are not allowed to trade with Britain. And the reason why that doesn't work is because they figure out a way to trade with Britain. They create black markets, underground trading goes on, things are smuggled, it happens whether Napoleon wants it to or not. And the other thing is, and I'm going to get to number 1 in a moment, but the other thing is beneath that is that Napoleon's conquest throughout all of Europe creates feelings of nationalism. And what nationalism is, you'll want to listen to this carefully so you can write it down. It is the sense of having a unique identity based on a common religion, a common language, a common history, a common set of national symbols even, like flags or the bald eagle in America could be a symbol that unites us as a nation of people. Why this weakens Napoleon, why nationalism weakens Napoleon, is because Napoleon, as he spreads his values across Europe, is really spreading the values of the French. Values that came out of French frustrations with French government. That's problematic because what he's then doing is imposing all of these things on all of these different nations that don't share France's same history. So there's resentment against that. And what people start to say is, what's best for France doesn't mean it's best for us. Us being the Spanish, us being who becomes the Germans, us who becomes the Italians, any of those groups of people. So anyway, back to Russia. Napoleon is going to try to conquer Russia. And he is going to go with 500,000 men, which back then is massive. And what ends up happening is that the leader of Russia at this time, a czar named Alexander I, knows he can't beat Napoleon. So what's going to end up happening is, as Napoleon's armies advance, Alexander's armies will fight a little bit and then retreat. And they'll fight a little bit and then retreat some more. And so Napoleon's army, if you guys think about Europe, Napoleon's army is moving further and further to the east toward Russia. And as this is happening, what they're coming across is scorched earth, meaning Alexander I is setting fire to Russian farmlands, Russian villages, so that all Napoleon's troops are going to get in their conquest is burnt land or scorched earth, meaning there's no food to sustain them, there's no shelter for them, there's nothing to help these troops live on foreign soil. When Napoleon and his army finally gets to Moscow, Moscow is deserted and on fire. And by then, winter is setting in Russia as well. And Napoleon's troops are not equipped to deal with the Russian winter. And they really didn't get anything out of this. So they have to retreat. They don't have enough to sustain these soldiers. And as they're retreating, they're in all these surprise attacks with the Russian army that the Russians are imposing on them. So when Napoleon returns back to Paris, he only has 20,000 soldiers left. So he is thoroughly weakened at this point. And you can kind of see the difficulties that Napoleon's army is going to deal with this winter. Now this chart down at the bottom, just really quickly, kind of just shows you with this yellow line here, or tan line, how strong Napoleon's army is, how large it is. And then as you see it get thinner and thinner and thinner, that means Napoleon's army is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So by the time they get to Moscow, they're forced to retreat. And on this black line, again, you just see shrinking, 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 to the point where he has 20,000 by the time he returns to Paris. So Napoleon is going to escape once he's defeated to the island of Elba. And he's going to basically be held, relatively speaking, prisoner there, ensuring that he won't potentially come back. But in 1815, he's going to gather the boys back together and try to restart the French tour all over again. And he makes an effort to restart all of this and reclaim the French Empire all over again. And all the nations who had fought against Napoleon, between the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, and the British, are going to rally together and fight against Napoleon in what is called the Battle of Waterloo, where he's going to lose. And at that point, Napoleon's going to be exiled, being kicked out, to the island of St. Helena. Now, you guys can see on the pictures, Elba is this little island right off the coast of Italy. And if you guys look and follow my mouse, there's Elba, there's France. It's not too hard to get from Elba back to France. And you guys can see in 1815, he did do that. But when he goes to St. Helena is this little dot in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He's never coming back from that. He's going to be exiled there until he dies. It's not known. Does he die of natural causes? Is he poisoned? What exactly happens to Napoleon? But needless to say, that is where he meets his end. And with him dies a really tremendous period in France where a lot of rights were instituted. But what needs to be kept in mind is those rights were instituted through the authority and the will of one single person. And if we recall that the French Revolution stands for liberty, equality, and fraternity, we kind of have to ask ourselves, do people really have liberty in France at this time? Newspapers were censored. Freedom of speech was not really a thing to the fullest extent, but equality of the law was put into place. Freedom to choose a job, serfdom was abolished. A lot of things come out of it, but was it really the full extent of the French Revolution? I would say no. That's where we kind of leave ourselves. So that's it. If you guys have any questions, definitely let me know when we get back to class. I'll see you then.